Margaret Cowell was standing at the edge of her own driveway when the appraiser said the thing that would turn out to be dead wrong. Get rid of it before it gets rid of you. Margaret didn't move from the edge of the drive. It's paid for, she said. That was never the problem, he said, with a short, not unkind laugh, already half turned toward his car. 400 of those say ruined in his hand, he said, quieter now. That's not sentiment anymore, Mrs. Cole. That's inventory. Something moved across her face, small, controlled, gone almost as soon as it arrived. It's exactly his handwriting, she said. That's the whole point. He studied her a second too long, like he'd expected a different answer. You've got a season, he said, maybe less. He got in the car without another word. She didn't watch him go. She was already looking past him, down the hill, toward 400 oak barrels her husband had spent 30 years filling, every single one stamped ruined in chalk, in his own handwriting. She had buried him 9 weeks earlier. She had not been down to that cellar since. She had no idea what was actually in those barrels, and neither did the bank, and neither did the man who just told her to get rid of them. It would take her most of a year to find out he'd been right, to keep every single one. Stay with me, and you'll get all of it. Every dead end, every door closed in her face, the exact number that finally proved him right. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Margaret Cowell, 54, had been a school teacher for 26 years, not a winemaker. She met Daniel at 23, at a harvest dance thrown for the whole valley, and what she remembered most from that first night wasn't anything he said. It was the way he stood at the edge of the room, watching the crush crew work instead of dancing, like the wine mattered to him more than the party ever could. She married that quality in him. She spent 3 decades living beside it. Daniel ran Cowell family cellars alone, the way his father had, and his father before him. 3 generations on 40 acres in the Willamette Valley, and not one of them had ever let a wife near the actual barrels. Daniel didn't do it out of cruelty. He did it out of habit, the same habit that told him a barrel gone wrong wasn't worth explaining, just marking and setting aside. That habit had a history longer than their marriage. Daniel's own father, August Cowell, had run the same cellar for 30 years before him, and August's rule about failure had been absolute. Nothing imperfect ever left the property in a form anyone outside the family could see. Daniel was 11, the first time he watched his father carry a barrel of off-spec wine out behind the equipment shed at dusk and pour it into the dry ground, rather than let a single neighbor see that a Cowell had made something less than right. He never forgot the sound of it, wine running into dirt in the dark, his father's face lit by nothing but a flashlight, not one word spoken the entire time. Daniel used to tell Margaret, in their first years married, that he'd sworn to himself as a boy he would never do that to a barrel of his own. He kept that promise. He just replaced pouring it out with hiding it away instead, which felt like progress to him and looked, to everyone else, exactly like his father's silence, wearing a different coat. There was one night, early in their marriage, that Margaret would return to often in the years after his death, though she couldn't have said exactly why. That particular evening stayed with her over so many others. She'd come down to the cellar to bring him dinner on a night he'd lost track of time, and found him standing over a barrel he'd just marked, chalk still in his hand, staring at the word he'd written like it had cost him something to write. She asked him, only half serious, whether he ever got tired of losing. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, without looking up from the barrel, "I'm not losing anything, Margaret. I'm just not smart enough yet to know what I actually have." She'd laughed at the time, assumed it was the kind of thing a tired man says at the end of a long day, and gone back upstairs to finish dinner without him. She would think about that sentence for the rest of her life, once she understood, 30 years later, and 9 weeks a widow, that he had meant it exactly as literally as he'd said it. By the time he died on a Tuesday morning in March, heart failing quietly in the equipment shed where nobody heard him fall, there were 400 of those marked barrels stacked 3 high in a cellar Margaret had entered maybe a dozen times in 3 decades of marriage. She found out later from the coroner that he'd likely been down there since before dawn. She would spend a long time afterward wondering what he'd been doing in that shed at 5 in the morning, alone, on a day that started like every other day of his life. The lawyer met her in April in an office that still smelled like new carpet, and he had the appraisal open on the desk before she'd even taken her coat off, already turned to the page he wanted her looking at. The land was worth something. The house was worth something. The bottled sellable wine was worth quite a lot, and it was already spoken for by 2 distributors, with contracts Daniel had signed the year before. He tapped the last line item twice, like he needed her to actually see it, before he said it out loud. 400 barrels, appraised, in his own report, as spoiled or off-spec product, non-recoverable. Insurance wouldn't touch it, he said, because Daniel had never once filed a claim on any of it in 30 years. He'd just kept stacking it. She asked him the only question she actually wanted answered, and it wasn't about the money. What made him keep it, if it was ruined? The lawyer looked at her the way people look at a question they don't have a box to file it under. He didn't answer. He just turned the folder around so it faced her properly and told her, gently enough, that grief made people want meaning in places that mostly just held liability. She closed the folder herself before he could turn to the next page. Her son-in-law called that same week, an accountant in Bend who ran the numbers twice over the phone, and told her, kindly, that the fastest way through grief was to sell the whole 40 acres to the winery, 2 properties over, and move somewhere the roof didn't leak. She could hear her daughter in the background, not arguing, just present, the way you're present for a decision you've already agreed with in advance. Margaret sat at her kitchen table that night with a glass of water she didn't drink, and a silence in the house she'd never once had to sit inside alone in 30 years. She went down to the cellar the next morning, before anyone could talk her out of it. It was cold, the way old stone stays cold, even in June, and it smelled like her husband, not his cologne, just him, the particular mix of oak and must and diesel that clung to every jacket he ever owned. She ran her hand along the first barrel. Ruined, chalked in Daniel's blocky hand, the same hand he used on grocery lists. She pulled the bung on the second barrel, just to see, and the smell that came off it wasn't spoiled at all. It was sharp and clean and strange. Nothing like wine, nothing like vinegar either. Something in between that she had no name for yet. She stood there a long time with her hand flat against the wood, the way you'd rest a hand on someone's back without waking them. At the very back of the cellar, behind 40 years of dust and a stack of crates, nobody had moved since the Clinton administration. She found his notebook, not a diary, a ledger, page after page in Daniel's cramped hand, going back to when he was younger than their own son was now. Batch numbers, dates, and beside each one marked ruined, a second word she'd never seen before, saved for. Saved for what? The notebook didn't say on the first page, or the 10th, but on page 40, in ink that had faded to brown, she found the sentence that kept her in that cellar until 2 in the morning. A wine that fails is not a wine that is finished. It is a wine that is asking for more time than anyone in this business is willing to give it. She had no idea, reading that sentence at 2 in the morning, that the hardest fight ahead of her wouldn't be with a distributor or a skeptical son-in-law at all. It would be with the state of Oregon and it would very nearly cost her everything before it was over. Her son-in-law called it sentimental nonsense over the phone the next day, not unkindly, just tired. The way you talk to someone you love, who you think is about to make a mistake, grief-shaped and temporary. The distributor who held 2 of Daniel's wine contracts, a man named Russ Halloran, drove out personally to tell her the same thing with better manners. He stood in her kitchen in a pressed shirt and told her that off-spec barrels get dumped, not aged, and that whatever her husband thought he was doing back there, the market did not pay for a widow's grief. She thanked him for driving out. She did not agree with him. She also did not know, yet, that he was wrong, or how long it would take him to admit it. She spent 3 weeks reading that notebook cover to cover before she touched another barrel, because she had learned exactly one lesson from 26 years in a classroom. You do not correct what you have not first understood. And what she came to understand was that her husband hadn't been keeping his failures. He'd been keeping his experiments, barrels where the fermentation had gone somewhere he didn't expect, batches too acidic to sell as wine, but that he suspected, without ever having the time or the courage to prove it, were becoming something else entirely. Something old, something that didn't have a shelf in most grocery stores because almost nobody made it properly anymore. A slow, barrel-aged vinegar, the kind that used to sell in small dark bottles for more money than the wine it came from. She had no idea yet how many wrong directions she'd have to walk down before she actually got there, or that the woman standing on her porch the following week would turn out to be a bigger obstacle than any of them. Before she could sell a single bottle of anything, she learned there was a second gatekeeper standing between her and that cellar, and this one carried a badge instead of a wine list. Carol Voss, from the State Department of Agriculture, showed up in May with a clipboard of her own and a face that had clearly delivered bad news to a great many people before Margaret. Any product sold as a food item in this state needs a licensed processing facility, Mrs. Cowell. A cellar that's been making wine informally for 30 years does not qualify, no matter what your husband believed about it. She wasn't unkind. She was simply unmovable, the way rules are unmovable, and she left Margaret with a binder of requirements thick enough to double as a doorstop. It would take her 5 months to satisfy every line item in that binder. One particular morning in July would come closer than anything else in this story to ending it early. Her first instinct, before she understood what she was actually holding, was to simply sell the wine as bulk to another winery 2 counties over, the way any sensible widow with 400 barrels of unlabeled inventory might. She drove out with 6 samples in the same cardboard box she'd later use for the lab, and the winemaker who tasted them, not unkindly, told her within about 4 minutes that whatever this was, it wasn't sellable as wine. Too acidic, too far gone, technically speaking already a different substance entirely. He didn't know what to call it either. He just knew his own facility couldn't touch it, and he said so, the way you'd tell someone their car wasn't worth the parts, not the way you'd insult the car. Her son-in-law called partway through that same week, checking in the careful way people check in when they're waiting to be proven right. She told him about the rejected sale, mostly because she couldn't think of a good reason to lie about it. He didn't say "I told you so," not in those words, but she heard the shape of it underneath his silence anyway. The particular quiet of a man recalculating how many more months he'd need to wait before this conversation ended the way he still assumed it would. She tried a second angle after that, encouraged by an article she'd half read about balsamic vinegar fetching high prices from a single Italian region, and spent 3 weeks trying to reduce a batch down the way she understood balsamic worked, cooking it low and slow on her own stovetop in a stockpot meant for canning tomatoes. What she produced was a thick, scorched, faintly burnt syrup that smelled like regret and stripped the enamel clean off the bottom of a pot she'd owned since her wedding year. She threw the whole batch out and washed the pot twice, and she was still standing at the sink with it when an old friend from her teaching years let herself in the back door the way she always had. Deborah Askew, who'd retired the same spring as Margaret, had come expecting the usual widow's visit, a casserole, and 20 minutes of careful conversation about how she was holding up. Instead, she found Margaret at the sink with a ruined pot and the whole kitchen smelling faintly of burnt sugar, and asked, not unkindly, whether this was actually a good idea or just a very elaborate way of not grieving properly. Margaret considered the question with more patience than it probably deserved. Both, she said, same answer she'd later give her own daughter, and Deborah, who had buried a husband of her own 9 years earlier, nodded like she recognized the shape of that answer better than anyone else who'd asked. She didn't try to talk her out of it after that. She dried the pot herself while Margaret got the notebook back out and asked, before she left, whether Margaret needed a second pair of hands for anything that didn't require a chemistry degree, and became, without either of them ever quite deciding it formally, the person who handled labels and paperwork while Margaret handled everything the notebook actually taught her. She sat back down at the kitchen table that same night, rereading the notebook front to back for a fourth time, because clearly what her husband had actually built wasn't balsamic, and wasn't wine, and wasn't anything she'd read about in an article, and she was going to have to let the notebook teach her what it actually was, instead of forcing it into a shape she already recognized. That was the real beginning of the slow, barrel-aged vinegar. Not a discovery, a correction, made after 2 confident wrong turns and 1 dried-off pot, the same way most of what mattered to Daniel had apparently been made. The breakthrough, when it came, arrived in a form so small she almost missed it. Buried in the margin of a page about temperature, in handwriting pressed hard enough to show through to the other side, Daniel had written a single line that wasn't about wine at all. Heat is not the enemy. Impatience is. Keep it low, keep it slow, and do not touch it, just because waiting feels like doing nothing. She read that line at 11 at night, with a kitchen thermometer taped to a wooden spoon, an image so much like something out of her husband's own workshop that she laughed out loud alone in an empty cellar. She kept the barrels at a steady, unhurried temperature after that, resisting the urge to check on them daily the way she'd resisted almost nothing else in her life. And the batches that came out of that patience were the ones that eventually made it into the 6 sample jars she drove to Portland. She believed, driving those 6 jars to Portland, that the hard part was finally over. It wasn't. The hardest part hadn't even started yet, and it would come from inside her own barrels, not from anyone standing outside them. Matching 400 individual barrels against 30 years of notebook entries turned out to be its own kind of labor, separate from anything she'd expected when she first sat down with the legal pad, evenings on her knees with a flashlight and a magnifying glass, cross-referencing faded batch numbers 3 and 4 times before she trusted her own reading of them, until she had a system, color-coded stickers for Ready Now, Another Year, and a stubborn cluster she'd simply have to open and taste for herself, the old-fashioned way, the only way her husband had apparently ever really trusted. She thought, finishing that system, that the worst of it was behind her. What she hadn't accounted for yet was that the people who loved her most were about to become the hardest part of all of it. Her daughter came out that weekend expecting to help her mother pack. Instead, she found Margaret at the kitchen table with a legal pad and Carol Voss's binder open beside it, writing out which of the 400 barrels matched the notebook's saved for markings, which ones needed another year, which ones were ready now. Her daughter sat down across from her without saying a word for a long time. Then she asked the only question that mattered. "Does this actually work, Mom, Or are you doing this because you're not ready to say goodbye to him?" Margaret didn't answer right away. Then she said the truest thing she'd said since March. "Both. It's both. And I don't think that makes it wrong." Renee came back the following week without the legal pad and without a single question about barrels or notebooks, and sat across from her mother at the same kitchen table for a long time before she said anything at all. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything back," she said. Margaret nodded. "When Dad died," Renee said, her voice steadier than her hands, "I didn't just lose him. I spent about a month afterward doing math I never told you about, how many years you probably had left, whether I'd get enough of them. And then you started disappearing into that cellar every single night, and some ugly, panicked part of me decided the fastest way to keep you safe was to get you out of here entirely, sell the land, move you somewhere with no barrels and no ladders and no reason to work yourself the way he worked himself." Margaret reached across the table and covered her daughter's hand with her own, the way she'd done at 100 smaller griefs over 29 years. "I know, baby. I was doing the same math from the other side of the table. I just came out with a different answer." Renee laughed, wet and short. "That's the most dad thing you've ever said to me." Margaret didn't disagree. The one person in the valley who didn't try to talk her out of anything was Ruth Ambrose, who ran the pear orchard 2 roads over and had lost her own harvest to a late frost the year before Daniel died. Ruth showed up on a Saturday with a thermos of coffee and no advice, which Margaret would later say was the only reason she let her stay. She just sat on an overturned crate in that cellar for 2 hours while Margaret sorted barrels, and eventually she said, out of nowhere, "My husband used to tell me a crop that fails once isn't a crop that's finished. It's a crop that's asking a different question than the one you asked it." Margaret looked at her a long moment. "That's almost exactly what's written in this notebook." Ruth just nodded, like she already knew that. Like some things get passed around a valley, whether anyone writes them down or not. Getting the cellar licensed took the better part of 5 months, and most of it was the kind of work that doesn't make for much of a story on its own. New drains, a hand-washing station Carol Voss specified down to the inch. The part that actually cost Margaret something was the pH testing, because the software Carol recommended cost more than the first bottling run would earn back, so she taught herself to do it by hand instead, hunched over the kitchen table with a chemistry textbook she'd bought used and a set of test strips she ruined 3 times before she understood what the color change was actually telling her. On the 3rd ruined batch, she put her head down on her folded arms for a full minute, in a kitchen that still had Daniel's reading glasses sitting on the windowsill where he'd left them, and let herself cry the way she hadn't let herself since the funeral, not because of the batch, but because he had apparently understood all of this without ever once writing down how, and she was going to have to learn it the slow way, alone, at 54, with a textbook meant for teenagers. Carol Voss came back in July, unannounced, on a morning Margaret had spent since 5 a.m. relabeling test jars, and walked the cellar with a flashlight, checking things Margaret hadn't known were on the list at all. The angle of the floor drain, the gap under a door, a thermometer 2 degrees out of state calibration. She found 6 things wrong, wrote up every one of them without softening a word, and told Margaret she had 30 days before the provisional permit lapsed, and she'd have to reapply from the start, application fee and all. This time Margaret didn't just stand there and take it. She followed her out to the truck, still in her work gloves, and asked her straight out whether the thermometer, at 2 degrees, had ever once made a person sick in the history of this valley. Carol Voss turned around at the truck door, and for the first time all year, she sounded less like a rule and more like a person defending one. "I don't get to decide which 2 degrees matter, Mrs. Cowell. I stopped being the one who decides that a long time ago, and honestly, some days I'd like to have that job back. Then she got in the truck and left the 6-item notice sitting on top of a barrel rather than handing it to her directly, the way you set down something you'd rather not be blamed for delivering. It was the closest Margaret came, in the whole ordeal, to simply giving up. She sat in her truck in the driveway afterward for the better part of an hour, engine off, hands still on the wheel, and she let herself think, just once, about the accountant's plan, the sale, the smaller house, the roof that didn't leak. She thought about how much simpler it would be to just say yes to that, to let the 40 acres go to the winery next door, and never again have to learn what a floor drain angle was supposed to be. Then she went back inside and got out the binder again, because she had already decided, without quite noticing when, that quitting in July would mean the crack in the bung and the 6 months of drains and Carol Voss's clipboard had all been for nothing, and she was not yet willing to let any of it mean nothing. She fixed 4 of the 6 items in 9 days working alone, and called Ruth for the other 2, because 2 of the drainage specifications needed a second pair of hands and a level neither of them had ever used before. They got it wrong the first time and had to redo it. Ruth didn't complain once, neither did Margaret, though she wanted to. Then, in August, with the license finally approved and 6 sample jars ready for the lab, came the moment that nearly ended the whole thing. The first round of results came back not exceptional, but contaminated. A wild yeast strain, the lab tech said, had likely gotten into 2 of the barrels through a cracked bung, souring what should have been her best batches into something genuinely undrinkable. Margaret sat with that call for a long time after she hung up. She had spent 5 months and most of what was left in the household savings account on drains and permits, and a process she'd taught herself out of a dead man's handwriting, and the first real test of it had failed. She went back to the notebook that night looking for anything she'd missed, and found it on page 81, a passage she'd read before, but never understood, because she hadn't yet lived the problem it was describing. A crack in a bung is not a flaw in the barrel. It is the barrel telling you it has given everything it has to give in that shape. Daniel had marked 3 of his own barrels the same way, decades earlier, and simply replaced the bungs and waited out a season before trying again. It took her the better part of a week to even know what she was looking for. She'd never learned to read a barrel the way Daniel had, by ear and by smell, so she did it the only way she knew how, methodically, the way she used to grade essays, 1 barrel at a time, checking every seal by hand under a headlamp in the cold. Ruth came out twice that week without being asked, holding a light steady, while Margaret ran her fingers along seams she couldn't always see. On the 4th day, she found the first crack, hairline, barely visible, exactly where the notebook said to look for it, at the lowest seam, where the wood had spent 3 decades taking on and releasing moisture with the seasons. 11 barrels, in the end, out of the 400, all clustered along the same cold wall of the cellar, all sealed with the same batch of bungs Daniel had apparently bought sometime in the early 2000s and never replaced. She drove 40 minutes to a cooperage in Salem for new ones, paid for them herself, and reset every seal by hand over 2 exhausting days, her knuckles split from the cold and the wood both. Margaret checked every barrel in the cellar afterward, one more time, and let the reset barrels sit undisturbed through the rest of the season, the way the notebook told her to. 6 weeks is a long time to wait for an answer to a question you're not entirely sure you asked correctly in the first place. She spent every one of those 6 weeks not knowing whether she'd actually fixed the problem or simply delayed finding out she hadn't. 6 weeks later, on a Sunday morning with Ruth standing beside her, she pulled the bung on the first of the resealed barrels and drew a small glass straight from the wood. What came out wasn't the murky, unsettled liquid she'd pulled from a barrel back in April. It was clear almost the way a held-up window is clear. a deep reddish mahogany with a thin, pale film clinging to the surface that the notebook called the mother, the living skin of the thing, proof it had actually become what it was trying to become, instead of just sitting there rotting. She held the glass up to the one bare bulb in the cellar and watched the light come through it, the color of a held match. She wet the tip of one finger and touched it to her tongue before she let herself think better of it. It hit sharp first, the way vinegar is supposed to, and then it didn't stop being sharp. It kept unfolding, something like dried fruit, and something like the inside of the oak itself, and something underneath that she would later struggle to describe to anyone, except to say it tasted like the year had actually happened to it, the way nothing off a store shelf ever does. Her eyes stung, and it wasn't only the acid. Ruth took the glass out of her hand without asking, and tasted it herself, and went quiet, in a way Margaret had never once seen her go quiet, not even at Daniel's funeral. "That good?" Margaret asked. Ruth didn't answer with words. She just held the glass back out for another taste, which was its own kind of answer. She drove 2 hours to that same food lab in Portland with 6 new samples in a cardboard box on the passenger seat, paid for the testing herself again, and waited 11 days that felt considerably longer than the first 11 had, if only because she already half knew what the glass in the cellar had told her. 4 of the 6 were unremarkable. 2 of them, the lab technician told her over the phone, were exceptional. Acidity, complexity, and a barrel character he said he hadn't tasted outside of imported product, costing $40 for a small bottle. He asked her, twice, where she'd gotten them. She told him the truth, a cellar everyone told her to sell, and a mistake she'd almost let stop her, and a taste on a Sunday morning that had already told her everything his instruments were now confirming with numbers. It took her 4 months after that to bottle the first run. 60 bottles, hand-labeled at her own kitchen table, with her daughter and Deborah Askew's help, sold quietly through a single specialty grocer in Portland who agreed to carry them as a favor to the lab technician who'd vouched for her. They sold out in 9 days. Ruth Ambrose bought 4 bottles and gave 3 of them away before Margaret found out and made her pay for the 4th. Not everyone who tried it loved it right away. One early buyer, a woman from a food blog with a modest but devoted following, posted a lukewarm review 3 weeks after the first sellout, calling the vinegar interesting but inconsistent, noting correctly that one of her 2 bottles tasted noticeably sharper than the other. Margaret read it standing at her kitchen counter and felt something cold drop through her chest, the particular fear of a person who has just started to believe in something, watching a stranger's words threaten to undo it in public. She didn't respond defensively. She wrote the blogger a short, honest email instead, explaining that batch variation was real and expected in a small batch, barrel-aged product, and offered to replace the sharper bottle at no cost if she'd be willing to try a second sample from a later batch. The blogger accepted, tried the replacement, and posted a follow-up 2 weeks later, walking back most of her original complaint, adding that the inconsistency itself was starting to feel like the point rather than the flaw. It was the first time Margaret understood that the thing she'd been most afraid people would hold against her, that no 2 barrels were ever quite identical, might actually be the reason people kept coming back. Ruth came by 2 weeks after the first sellout with something other than coffee on her mind, though it took her the better part of an hour circling the barn before she said it outright. Her own orchard was in trouble, a fungal blight working through the north block of pear trees that her usual spray schedule wasn't touching, and the county extension office had told her flatly that a bad enough season could put her under within 2 years. She hadn't come to ask Margaret for money. She'd come, it turned out, because she didn't know who else to talk to, who might actually understand what it felt like to watch something you'd spent 30 years tending get quietly written off by people holding clipboards. Margaret didn't have an answer for pear blight. She wasn't a horticulturist, and she said so plainly, standing in her own cellar with flowers still on her hands from a morning of label printing. But she did the only thing she knew how to do, with a problem shaped like this one, which was pull out the notebook and start reading out loud from a page near the back she'd skipped over twice before, because it wasn't about wine or vinegar at all. Daniel's father, August, decades earlier, had once nursed a blighted block of his own grapevines back using a copper-based treatment mixed at half the recommended strength and applied twice as often, a method he'd never once published or shared because the county considered it unorthodox, and August considered sharing anything a form of weakness. Ruth listened to the whole page without interrupting, then asked, quietly, whether she could photocopy it. It worked well enough by the following spring that Ruth's north block came back thin but alive, and she took to telling anyone who asked that she owed her pears to a dead man's handwriting the same way Margaret owed him her entire second life. Margaret never once pointed out that August Cole's own son had spent 40 years hiding that same handwriting instead of sharing it freely the way Ruth now was. Some corrections only need to happen once to start traveling on their own. A chef from a small restaurant in southeast Portland tracked down the grocer's number and left a message asking, almost urgently, whether she could count on more before she printed a vinaigrette built entirely around it onto a new tasting menu. From Seattle came a handwritten note tucked into a return envelope, from a woman who said only that it was the first thing she'd bought in a year that reminded her of her grandmother's pantry, and would there ever be a gift set. The one that stayed with Margaret longest came by phone, not a note. A retired winemaker 2 counties over, a man who'd known Daniel for 20 years and drunk his wine at 100 dinners, asked her a single question and then went quiet, waiting for the answer. Had Daniel been sitting on this the whole time and never told anyone? Margaret didn't know how to answer that one for a long time. Eventually she just said, "I don't think he knew it was finished yet." That was the truest thing she had. Carol Voss came back one final time in October for what was supposed to be a routine annual review, and this time she moved through the cellar slowly, instead of hunting, running her hand along the same drain she'd once written up, testing the same door gap that had cost Margaret 2 of the 6 original violations. She stood in the doorway a long moment afterward with her binder still closed against her hip. "My father ran a dairy for 40 years and never once got the paperwork right, and it cost him the business," she said, and Margaret understood, from the way she said it, that this was the first time all year Carol Voss had told her anything true about herself rather than about a regulation. "This is the first time I've come out here and had nothing left to write down." It wasn't an apology. It also wasn't nothing. And Margaret understood, watching her drive away, that some people only know how to say they respect you by finally leaving you alone. What actually brought Russ Halloran back in November had less to do with the sellout numbers than he ever admitted to Margaret directly. A colleague at another distributorship had passed him a bottle in October, not knowing whose cellar it had come from, and Russ had poured himself a small taste alone in his own kitchen on a Tuesday night, the way he tasted everything he was considering picking up, purely on its own merits, no context, no story attached. It took him a full minute to place the barrel character, and another minute after that, checking the label properly for the first time, to realize exactly whose driveway he'd once stood in, telling a grieving widow that grief didn't pay the bills. He sat with that discomfort longer than he sat with most things. Then he picked up the phone. Russ Halloran, the distributor who'd stood in her kitchen telling her the market didn't pay for grief, came back in November, this time asking, not telling. He'd heard about the sellout secondhand, the way news traveled in that valley, and he sat at the same kitchen table where he'd once delivered his verdict on Daniel's judgment and asked her, plainly, what it would take to carry the product. He offered numbers first, the way distributors do, a per-case rate that would have made the household budget considerably easier. Margaret didn't answer the numbers at all. She let him wait 3 weeks for an answer, the way she'd waited on everyone else's opinion of her for the better part of a year, not out of spite, but because she genuinely needed the time to decide what she actually wanted this to become. Then she told him the same thing her husband would have told him, if he'd ever had the nerve to say it while he was alive. This isn't for sale, the way you sell everything else. If you want it, you sell it the way he made it. Slowly. And you don't rush the label copy either. And you don't ask me to double the batch size to hit a number that has nothing to do with what's actually in the barrel. Russ Halloran sat with that for a moment, the way a man sits with terms he didn't expect to be given, rather than allowed to set himself. Then he said, the only thing that made her trust him at all. All right. Slowly then, word of the seller's turnaround moved through the valley, the slow way news travels among people who mostly see each other at the feed store rather than anywhere else. 2 other small growers came by separately that winter, both of them carrying the particular carefulness of people who'd been told no by enough institutions to expect it again. Del Fenton, who ran a small plum orchard 2 towns over, had been sitting on a surplus nobody wanted for 3 seasons running, most of it going to a compost pile behind his equipment barn. Carla Whitson, whose family had grown cherries on the same 12 acres for 2 generations, had been quietly dumping bruised fruit for 6 years, rather than let it rot visibly where a buyer might see it and ask questions. Margaret didn't say yes to either of them right away. She spent a full week with each sample, the way she'd learned to spend a week with anything worth trusting, testing before she committed to anything, and by spring, she had 2 new small batch products sitting on the same shelf as the original vinegar, a plum barrel reduction and a cherry shrub, neither one large enough yet to matter much financially, both of them mattering enormously to 2 families who had mostly stopped believing anyone still wanted what they had left over. Del Fenton, at the exchange of the first check, said the only thing that seemed to need saying out loud between people who'd both spent years being told their surplus was worthless. Didn't figure anybody'd still be doing this the slow way. Margaret didn't correct him. She just handed him next season's contract and let the 2 of them shake on it, the way her husband apparently never had, with someone standing right there to see it happen. 6 months after that first sellout, Margaret had a waiting list longer than her production capacity, and one evening in December, she finally sat down and did the arithmetic her husband never had, because he'd never let himself believe there was a number worth writing down. She did it on the same legal pad she'd used to sort the barrels back in April. 60 bottles at $32 against materials that had cost her almost nothing. And when the total came out to just under $19,000 for the year, more than the lawyer's entire remaining wine inventory, she didn't say anything out loud at all. She just sat there at the kitchen table a while, the way you sit with a number that isn't really about money. Then she closed the legal pad and told her daughter, the next time she called, that she'd decided against expanding the cellar. Growth was never what the notebook had been arguing for. Her daughter, who had come around slowly, and then completely over the course of that year, didn't argue back. Her son-in-law, to his credit, was the one who ended up building her a proper batch tracking spreadsheet the following spring, and he did it without being asked, dropping by on a Saturday with a laptop and an apology he didn't quite know how to phrase directly. I ran the wrong numbers, he told her, setting the laptop on her kitchen table like a peace offering. I ran what the land was worth. I never once ran what you were worth to it. Margaret didn't let him off easy. Not entirely. though she also didn't make him suffer for it longer than the moment required. She just handed him a printout of her hand-kept records from the first year, and asked whether he thought he could make sense of her handwriting well enough to build something useful out of it. He could. He never once brought up Bend or the roof again, and the spreadsheet he built her, imperfect and a little over-engineered the way accountants tend to build things, became the one piece of the whole operation that ran exactly the way he'd always wanted everything in her life to run, efficiently and without a single surprise left in it. 2 years later, Family Cellars still makes wine, because the land still calls for it. But the cellar out back, the one the appraiser told her wasn't worth the insurance, now produces something with her husband's name on the label and her own signature on every batch record, because she is the one who grades it now, the way he never let anyone grade anything beside him. Ruth Ambrose's pear orchard supplies 2 of the barrels now, an experiment of Margaret's own that isn't in the notebook at all, and that felt, she said, like the first page she got to write herself. She kept the notebook on a shelf at the front of the cellar instead of the back. Anyone who visits can read the first page. A wine that fails is not a wine that is finished. Some nights, standing in the cellar long after the day's work was done, Margaret found herself repeating a much older sentence out loud, to no one in particular, one Daniel had said to her 30 years earlier, and she hadn't understood until she was 9 weeks a widow. I'm not losing anything. I'm just not smart enough yet to know what I actually have. It had taken her the better part of a year, and every barrel in that cellar, to finally understand it wasn't a confession. It was an instruction, left for whoever eventually came looking, patient enough to wait as long as it took. A young woman came up the gravel drive last spring, 26 years old, laid off from a corporate job she'd hated, and looking, she said, for something real to put her hands into. She'd found the specialty grocer's shelf by accident, bought a bottle on a whim, and driven out on a Sunday with no appointment, just the address off the label and a question she wasn't sure how to ask yet. Margaret walked her through the cellar slowly, stopping wherever the young woman stopped, answering whatever she pointed at instead of reciting a tour she'd given before. When the young woman ran her fingers along one of the drains without knowing what it had cost to install, Margaret found herself telling her about Carol Voss, not as a complaint, but the way you tell someone about a person who turned out to matter more than they seemed to at the time. The young woman asked her, near the end of the tour, whether it had been worth it. 2 years in, all of it. The permits, the failed batch, the years of waiting rooms she'd have to sit in that Margaret hadn't mentioned, but that were plainly written into every line on her face. Margaret thought about it longer than the question probably deserved. Worth it isn't quite the word, she said finally. It's more that I couldn't have lived with the alternative. There's a difference between those two things, even if they end up looking the same from the outside. At the end of the tour, she handed her a photocopy of page 40, not the whole notebook, just that one page, because some things you have to earn the rest of before they mean anything. She told her about the 2 wrong turns too, the bulk wine sale that went nowhere, the scorched balsamic experiment that ruined a good pot, because she'd decided somewhere in the last 2 years that the failures were as much a part of what she had to teach as anything that actually worked. You're going to get the shape of this wrong at least twice before you get it right, she told the young woman. That's not a warning. That's just the schedule. The young woman read the photocopied page twice, standing right there in the cold with her coat still zipped. Then she asked if she could come back next Saturday. Margaret said the cellar would still be here, and so, if she wanted it, would the rest of the notebook, 1 page at a time, the way she'd earned it herself. If you're still here, thank you. That means something. Because somewhere close to you right now, there's a room, a relationship, a version of yourself that somebody decided was finished before its time. So tell me in the comments, What's the thing everyone told you to let go of, that you kept anyway? I read every single one. And if this one was worth your time, subscribe. There's another story like it coming soon.